Close your eyes for a moment and imagine waking up before dawn in the greatest city the ancient world had ever seen. The air is already thick with the smell of fresh bread drifting from the bakeries below, mingling with the sharp scent of the Tiber River not far away. Somewhere in the narrow alley outside your window, a cart driver is arguing with a merchant, their voices bouncing off limestone walls still warm from yesterday's sun. Rome is already awake. Rome is always already awake. At its peak, the city of Rome held somewhere between 1 and 2 million souls, packed into a living, breathing labyrinth of streets, markets, temples, and towering apartment blocks called insulae. These were not quiet, orderly streets. They were rivers of human noise, vendors shouting the price of olives, children darting between the legs of senators in their white togas, slaves carrying litters through crowds that simply refused to part. The Roman Empire stretched from the misty hills of Britain to the burning sands of Egypt, and all of it, every coin, every conquest, every cargo ship heavy with grain, seemed to pour eventually into this one thundering city. But what did it mean to actually live here? What did it mean to work here? For most Romans, life was defined not by ambition but by birthright. The rigid social hierarchy of Rome placed citizens above freedmen, freedmen above slaves, and the wealthy elite above almost everyone. Where you were born largely determined what you would become. A child born to a blacksmith would likely swing a hammer. A child born to a senator would eventually wear the purple stripe. The machinery of Roman society was efficient precisely because it was so deeply stratified. Everyone had a role. Everyone was expected to stay in it. And yet, and this is what makes Rome so endlessly fascinating, the cracks in that system were everywhere. Slaves could earn their freedom and build businesses. Talented soldiers could rise to command legions. Clever men of modest birth could, through skill and the right patron, find themselves at the very center of Roman power. The empire was rigid, yes, but it was also hungry. It consumed talent wherever it found it. Work in Rome was not what we would recognize today. There were no offices, no 9-to-5 rhythms, no separation between the personal and the professional. Business was conducted in bathhouses and at dinner parties. Contracts were sealed with a handshake and a witness. Reputation was everything. And it travelled fast in a city where everybody knew everybody's patron, every patron knew every senator, and every senator owed something to somebody else. So what were the best jobs in this extraordinary, exhausting, magnificent world? Not the jobs that history remembers most loudly, the generals, the emperors, the conquerors, but the ones that offered something rarer in the ancient world: comfort, influence, creativity, and perhaps even joy. The ones, if you had been born 2,000 years earlier, you might actually have wanted. Pull the blanket a little closer. Imagine being one of the most powerful people in the Roman Empire without ever commanding a single soldier. Imagine having the ear of emperors, the gratitude of senators, and a home filled with the finest things money could buy. All because you understood something most Romans feared deeply: the human body and what happened when it began to fail. In ancient Rome, a skilled physician occupied a unique and remarkable position. Medicine in the ancient world was not the clean, sterile science we know today. It was something wilder, more instinctive, built from centuries of observation, experiment, and inherited wisdom stretching back to the Greeks. And it was precisely because medicine was so rare, so difficult, and so desperately needed that those who practiced it well could rise to heights that seemed almost impossible for someone not born into the aristocracy. Most Roman physicians were Greek. This is one of history's quietly wonderful ironies. Rome conquered Greece militarily, and Greece conquered Rome intellectually. The Romans, pragmatic as ever, recognized that the Greeks had spent generations thinking carefully about the body, about disease, about the relationship between what a person ate, how they slept, and how long they lived. And so Greek doctors flooded into Rome, and the smart ones quickly discovered that this city of 1 million people, many of them wealthy, all of them mortal, represented the greatest medical opportunity the ancient world had ever produced. The most famous of them all was Galen of Pergamon. Born in 129 AD, he arrived in Rome as a young man already brilliant and burning with ambition. He began by treating gladiators, a position that sounds grueling but was, in fact, a masterclass in anatomy. Gladiators bled, broke, tore, and sometimes survived wounds that should have killed them. Galen learned more in that gladiatorial school than most physicians learned in a lifetime. He studied how muscles attached to bone. He watched what happened when organs were exposed to open air. He developed techniques for treating infection and closing wounds that were centuries ahead of their time. And then the emperors noticed him, first Marcus Aurelius, then Commodus, then Septimius Severus. Galen became physician to the imperial family, a position that came with extraordinary privilege. He lived in comfort, travelled freely, wrote prolifically, and influenced medical thinking, or over 1,000 years after his death, his books were still being taught in European universities in the 17th century. But you did not need to be Galen to live well as a Roman physician. Even a moderately skilled doctor, operating in a prosperous Roman town, could build a comfortable, respected life. They charged fees for consultations, sold herbal remedies, and developed loyal clients who returned year after year. Unlike many Roman professions, medicine offered something genuinely precious: the chance to help people, to solve real problems, and to be thanked sincerely for it. In a world where so much suffering went unanswered, the physician who showed up with steady hands and genuine knowledge was worth more than gold. We are only just beginning. There is a particular kind of immortality that belongs only to builders. Poets are forgotten when their manuscript crumble. Generals are erased when the empires they fought for collapse into dust. But the man who designed a bridge that still carries weight after 2,000 years, he lives forever in a way that is almost impossible to argue with. Stone does not lie. Stone does not forget. And in ancient Rome, the architects who shaped the physical world of the empire understood this truth better than almost anyone. To be a Roman architect was to stand at the intersection of art and science in a way that no other profession quite matched. It demanded the creativity of a sculptor, the precision of a mathematician, the authority of a general, and the patience of a monk. A Roman architect did not simply draw plans and hand them to someone else. He lived on his building sites. He negotiated with suppliers of marble and timber. He managed teams of labourers, slaves, and specialist craftsmen. He solved problems that had never been solved before, because Rome was constantly demanding things that had never been built before. Consider the Pantheon, that breathtaking circular temple in the heart of Rome, crowned with a dome so perfectly engineered that modern architects still study it with something close to reverence. Its oculus, that single open eye at the very top of the dome, lets in a column of light that moves slowly across the interior throughout the day, like a sundial written in sunshine. The man or men who designed it understood not just how to stack stone, but how space itself could be made to feel divine. Walking into the Pantheon today, nearly 2,000 years after its construction, still produces a sensation that is difficult to name. That sensation is the architect's signature, pressed into concrete and marble for eternity. The Romans invented concrete as we would recognize it, a mixture they called opus caementerium, and it changed everything. Suddenly, walls did not need to be solid cement. Arches could span distances that would have been unthinkable in earlier centuries. Aqueducts could carry fresh water across valleys and hills for dozens of miles, delivering it to fountains and bathhouses and the private homes of the wealthy. The architect who understood concrete was an architect who could reshape geography itself, and the rewards for doing so were extraordinary. Imperial commissions brought not just payment, but prestige of the highest order. To have your name associated with a public building in Rome, a forum, a bathhouse, a temple, was to enter a conversation about power and civilization that echoed across the entire empire. Wealthy patrons competed fiercely for talented architects, offering generous fees, social elevation, and the kind of access to Roman high society that most citizens could never dream of. There was also something quieter, but perhaps more satisfying. At the end of a long career, a Roman architect could walk through the city he had helped to build and see his work everywhere, in the curve of an arch, in the fall of shadow across a colonnade, in the sound of water rushing through an aqueduct he had designed decades before. Very few professions in any era offer that particular irreplaceable gift, the gift of having made something real that outlasted everything else. In a world where most people could not read, the person who could was never truly powerless. Think about that for a moment. In ancient Rome, literacy was not the default condition of civilization, the way we assume it to be today. It was a skill rare and valuable, possessed by perhaps 10 to 30% of the population, depending on where and when you looked. And in a society built on contracts, correspondence, law, and literature, the person who commanded written language commanded something close to invisible authority, the kind that moved quietly through rooms, that shaped decisions before they were announced, that whispered into the ears of the powerful and was rarely given full credit for what it accomplished. The Roman scribe was, in many ways, the engine beneath the machine. Emperors issued edicts, but scribes wrote them. Senators debated policy, but scribes recorded it. Wealthy merchants conducted trade across 3 continents, but scribes drafted the letters, calculated the figures, and kept the accounts that made the whole elaborate system function without collapsing under its own complexity. To be a skilled scribe in ancient Rome was to be indispensable in the most practical and immediate sense of the word. Your employer could not function without you. That knowledge, quiet and unspoken, was its own form of power. Many scribes began their careers as slaves, educated ones, often Greek, purchased specifically for their literacy and trained further by their owners. But here is where Rome's system revealed one of its more surprising dimensions. A talented slave scribe who served a wealthy household faithfully could, over time, earn his freedom. And once freed, his skills did not disappear with his chains. Freedmen scribes who had spent years inside the households of senators and generals emerged into the world knowing its secrets, its rhythms, and its most important people. Some built thriving businesses as professional letter writers and document keepers. Others parlayed their connections into positions of genuine civic influence. Then there were the poets. Roman society adored its poets with an enthusiasm that feels almost foreign to modern eyes. Virgil, Horace, Ovid, these were not obscure literary figures appreciated only by academics. They were celebrities. Their verses were quoted at dinner parties, recited at public festivals, scratched onto the walls of taverns by admirers who may not have fully understood every line but recognized the beauty in the sound of them. A poet who captured the imagination of Rome captured something invaluable, the attention of its most powerful citizens. Patronage was the engine that drove literary life. Wealthy Romans competed to sponsor talented poets, housing them, feeding them, and funding their work in exchange for dedications, flattery, and the cultural prestige of being associated with great art. The poet Horace enjoyed the generous patronage of Maecenas, one of the most influential men in Augustan Rome, and lived a life of genuine comfort and creative freedom as a result. He wrote when inspiration struck, travelled when he wished, and died, having produced some of the most enduring verses in human history. For the right person, curious, articulate, sharp with language and sharper still with people. The world of Roman words offered a life that was rich not just in comfort but in meaning, and in any era that is perhaps the rarest reward of all. Forget everything the movies have told you about gladiators. Forget the image of desperate, broken men hurled into an arena to die for the amusement of a bloodthirsty crowd. That picture is not entirely wrong, but it is profoundly incomplete, because behind every gladiator who stepped onto the sand of the Colosseum, behind every roar of a crowd 50,000 strong, behind every moment of choreographed violence that made Rome hold its breath, there was a businessman, a careful, calculating, extraordinarily wealthy businessman who had built that moment from the ground up. His title was Lannister, and his life was one of the most remarkable in the entire Roman world. A Lannister was the owner and manager of a gladiatorial school called a ludus, and running a ludus was not a romantic adventure. It was a serious commercial enterprise that required the skills of a talent scout, a military trainer, a financial investor, a publicist, and a negotiator, all wrapped into one relentlessly practical human being. The Lannister purchased fighters, sometimes slaves, sometimes prisoners of war, sometimes free men who had voluntarily signed contracts in exchange for food, shelter, and the slim but intoxicating possibility of fame. He fed them, housed them, trained them, and kept them alive, because a dead gladiator was an asset that could no longer generate revenue. This last point is crucial and almost always overlooked. The Lannister had every financial incentive to keep his gladiators healthy. These men were investments, and expensive ones. A well-trained fighter represented years of careful development and significant monetary outlay. Killing them carelessly was like burning your own warehouse. Roman gladiatorial schools employed dedicated physicians, some of the best available, including the young Galen himself during his early career, to treat injuries, manage nutrition, and maximize the physical condition of every fighter on the roster. The gladiators of a well-run ludus were, in many respects, among the best-fed and best-cared-for men in the entire empire. The business model was elegantly simple. Magistrates, politicians, and wealthy citizens who wished to sponsor public games, and sponsoring games was one of the most powerful ways to buy public affection and political influence in Rome, came to the Lannister and negotiated contracts. They paid per fighter, per appearance, with additional fees if a gladiator was killed during the event. The Lannister set his prices, protected his best performers, and managed his roster the way a modern sports agent manages a roster of elite athletes. Reputation mattered enormously. A Lannister whose fighters performed brilliantly and thrillingly could command premium rates from the most prestigious clients in the city. The social status of a Lannister was complicated and fascinating. Roman society officially looked down on the profession. It was considered disreputable in the way that anything associated with blood and commerce simultaneously tended to be. And yet the Lannister who ran a famous school was courted by senators, recognized in the street, and invited to events that his official social standing should have placed far beyond his reach. Money, in Rome as everywhere, had a remarkable talent for dissolving the boundaries that polite society pretended were permanent. To run a ludus at the height of Rome's imperial power was to sit at the beating heart of Roman popular culture, growing rich on the city's most spectacular obsession. Close your eyes and imagine the smell of ancient Rome on a warm afternoon. Not the smell, the streets, that was something considerably less pleasant. But the smell of its markets, the thick, resinous cloud of frankincense drifting from a temple nearby. The sharp brightness of black pepper carried in sacks from a ship that had sailed all the way from southern India, the honeyed warmth of cinnamon, the dark mystery of myrrh, the floral intoxication of rose oil, pressed in Egypt and transported across the Mediterranean in sealed alabaster jars. These were not ordinary smells. They were the smell of wealth, of power, of a civilization so vast and so hungry that it reached across half the known world simply to satisfy its appetite for beauty. Rome's appetite for luxury goods was, by any measure, staggering. The empire imported pepper, silk, ivory, amber, precious stones, exotic animals, rare woods, and perfumes in quantities that shocked even contemporary observers. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder complained bitterly that Rome was hemorrhaging gold to the east in exchange for frivolities. He estimated that India, Arabia, and China drained the empire of 100 million sesterces every single year. What Pliny failed to appreciate, or perhaps simply refused to acknowledge, was that the men facilitating this extraordinary flow of goods were not draining Rome, they were enriching themselves beyond imagination while doing it. The spice merchant occupied a position in Roman commerce that combined the excitement of exploration with the rewards of shrewd investment. These were not simple shopkeepers haggling over vegetables in a local market. The great merchants of Rome operated across networks that spanned continents, maintained agents in Alexandria, Antioch, and the ports of southern Arabia, and navigated relationships with traders, sailors, caravan leaders, and foreign rulers whose cooperation was essential to keeping the supply lines open. A Roman merchant dealing in pepper and cinnamon was, in the most literal sense, a global businessman operating at the edge of the known world. The perfumers occupied a slightly different but equally privileged niche. In Rome, perfume was not a luxury in the way we might casually define the word today. It was a necessity of social life for anyone with pretensions to refinement. Romans perfumed their bodies, their clothing, their homes, their dinner parties, and even their wine. The workshops of skilled perfumers, called unguentarius, were among the most profitable small businesses in any Roman city. A master perfumer who had developed signature blends favoured by wealthy clients built relationships that lasted generations. With recipes passed down like family heirlooms and client lists that read like a directory of Roman aristocracy. What made the life of a successful spice merchant or perfumer so genuine, enviable, was not just the wealth it generated, though the wealth was real and considerable. It was the extraordinary breadth of the life itself. These men corresponded with traders in languages they had learned out of necessity. They tasted and evaluated products from cultures Rome had barely mapped. They stood in Mediterranean ports watching ships arrive from the edge of the world, their holds full of things that would make Roman hearts race and Roman purses open without hesitation. In a civilization that valued comfort, beauty, and sensory pleasure with almost religious devotion, the man who supplied those pleasures most elegantly was never far from the very top of Roman life. There is one final door to open in our journey through the working world of ancient Rome. It is heavier than the others, carved from something older and stranger, care, and when it swings wide, it reveals not a marketplace, or a building site, or a school filled with the clash of iron, but a world of silence, ceremony, and extraordinary privilege. A world where the boundaries between the human and the divine were believed to be genuinely thin, where the right words spoken at the right moment could determine the fate of an empire, and where the men and women who performed those words lived lives so carefully protected by Roman law that they existed almost outside the normal rules of human society altogether. The priestly class of ancient Rome was not a single unified institution. It was a constellation of different sacred offices, each with its own history, its own rituals, and its own remarkable set of privileges. But among them all, the most ancient and the most venerated were the flamines, the priests dedicated to specific deities, and above them all stood the Flamen Dialis, the high priest of Jupiter himself, king of the Roman gods. His life was governed by a web of sacred restrictions so elaborate and so strange that it reads today almost like a riddle. He could not touch iron, he could not look upon an army, he could not spend more than 3 consecutive nights outside the city of Rome. He could not walk under a vine. His wife held her own sacred office and could not be divorced from him under any circumstances. These restrictions sound like burdens, and in some practical sense they were, but they came wrapped in compensations that made the office one of the most coveted in all of Rome. The Flamen Dialis held automatic membership in the Senate. He was preceded in public by a lictor, a ceremonial attendant, who cleared his path and announced his arrival. He was exempt from military service, from taxation, and from most of the legal obligations that governed ordinary Roman citizens. His person was considered sacred, which meant that harming him in any way was not merely a cry, but a profound act of religious pollution with consequences that extended far beyond the legal system. And then there were the Vestal Virgins, perhaps the most extraordinary religious office in the entire Roman world. 6 women, selected between the ages of 6 and 10 from noble families, committed 30 years of their lives to tending the sacred flame of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, whose fire was believed to be directly connected to the survival of Rome itself. In exchange for this commitment and the strict celibacy it demanded, the Vestals received privileges that no other Roman women, and very few Roman men, could claim. They controlled their own property. They could free condemned prisoners simply by encountering them on the road. They held seats of honor at every public spectacle in the city. Their legal testimony required no oath because their word was already considered sacred. As our long and wandering journey through the working world of ancient Rome draws gently to a close, one truth settles quietly over everything we have seen. Rome was brutal and magnificent in equal measure, a civilization that could build the Pantheon and fill the Colosseum with blood on the same afternoon. But inside that contradiction, for those fortunate enough to find the right path, it offered lives of genuine richness, creative, comfortable, purposeful, and sometimes even transcendent. The physician healing the broken, the architect raising stone toward the sky, the poet finding the perfect word, the merchant standing in a harbour smelling the spices of a world beyond the horizon. Each of them, in their own way, had found something worth waking up for in the greatest city the ancient world ever produced. And now, as the torches burn low and Rome settles into its brief and restless night, so do we.